Here's another PHNX Community Call, and we are going to record this, pop it in the library. Um, Feel free to go through at your own speed, frequency. Reach out, as always, if you have any questions, either directly to me, into the community, or to anyone else in the community, because they might know the answer too. Um, and today we will get going on something which is an integral part of coaching. Almost, I would call it one of the three legs of the tripod of coaching, where you've got your listening, and then you've got your questioning, and then you've got your feedback. And they are all incredibly important in order to be able to facilitate an effective coaching journey. But we're going to be focusing today on feedback. So, not the sense whereby you might sit down and give like a performance review feedback, but more in a sense of conversational coaching feedback. And what does that look like? The aim of feedback is obviously, from a coaching perspective, to create and facilitate insightful learning and change towards a goal or several agreed goals. And as by nature of this community, in this way of how I work, we're looking at it through the emotional mastery lens. And what does feedback look like? And we're going to bring in the SBII model, which is a strong framework which can be used very effectively and can often yield fantastic results if there is reflection that goes along with implementation. With the development side of things, I have set out a few questions here. So if you're uh, listening live, take a photo of that, screenshot if you will, um, and then we can come back and kind of talk about these and reflect on them at the end after the session. So, firstly, I actually want to consider how we give feedback and how it can be a important retention tool. When we have our client engagement, and that essentially should be fairly high early doors. If we've onboarded well, if we've contracted well, if we've agreed expectations and started and implemented the journey effectively, we should start to see some sort of engagement levels elevate fairly high over 1 month, 2 months, 3 months, maybe 4 months. At some point, we're going to reach the required time to have feedback delivered to our clients. Now, the way in which this can positively impact retention is by it being constructed in a way that strengthens the relationship, in a way that moves the needle more for the client towards their goal, feedback that has a consolidating effect of the whole coaching process. If we either fail to give feedback appropriately, or we just give no feedback at all, which is also something which happens, and we just carry on trotting along our merry way delivering coaching sessions, then there is a distinctive possibility that we end up in a position of compliance or going through the motions. And you think going through the motions, it's kind of like a disengagement. It's actually a very mechanical and robotic process that isn't what coaching is about. Coaching is about dynamic nature. It's about inspiration. It's about like learning and reflecting and perspective change, not disengagement, not robotic mechanical operations. So that's where, you can see in this diagram here that you've got this diverging point, okay, where you're going to have to give feedback, and this depends on the agreement of how long the particular period of coaching is, or if in fact you need to step in and give some feedback at an earlier point, then you can see where this can go one of two ways. So you can't really put enough emphasis on how important to have structured feedback, have a system for feedback, have an allowance for intuitive feedback as well. And when you lack the emotional awareness, intelligence, or capacity to be able to give feedback appropriately, you might just kind of leave it on a superficial level. It remains very transactional. And with regards to transactional versus transformational coaching, transactional coaching is and will become very uh, out of date very quickly. If not, with a client, transactional is important to initiate, but transformational is something you need to move into. Stay too much transactional for too long, and that can often have a negative effect on retention and on the cohesiveness of the client and coach collaboration and the journey. So one of the considerations that we need to make is why feedback in a traditional sense can often fail. Not always fail. However, it does tend to be quite fragile in its nature. So when we think about the idea of the threat response and why that would come about if you are delivering feedback. So if it's vague, if it's evaluative, if it has a almost entwined in that individual's personality or their identity, it can be perceived as a bit of an attack. And when that happens, cortisol rises, prefrontal cortex shut down, defensiveness and resistance. We are not going to be able to think rationally, clearly, in a solution focused way in order to be able to move past any issues or obstacles that arise. Okay. Now, if we're in a more of awareness setup, we can be structured and we can have and remain an objective position on the feedback. Hard on performance, soft on the person is a catchphrase that I learned very early on in my tenure at corporate fitness and managing people as well as clients. It's not about the person. It's about the performance, and to be able to remain and find yourself in that objective position if you're giving and when you're giving feedback, obviously still having the conversations, person to person, relational conversations, but then when you're thinking on the performance, remain objective about it. And that often will allow that reflection and processing in the prefrontal cortex. Happy days, we can start to move along nicely to find the solutions that we need to within the coaching conversation. Now, the SBII feedback loop. So this in a quite a constructed way, you can see how this might look when we are delivering coaching. So situation is the first point of contact. So establishing precision around the accuracy of what's happening, whether it be physical, temporal anchors, but essentially we need to make sure that we are and have a very aligned understanding of what we're actually discussing with the context of this piece of feedback. If it's too ambiguous, it's a bad starting point. So then we look at the behavior and it's described objectively. Camera variable actions, I'll come on to a nice little kind of analogy that can often work really well in the behavior observations, then the impact sharing the real world consequence, i.e., how is this actually working? Using I statements are very effective for that. Um, and then the intent, where we would look at the drive or ambition and the gap between that and the actions, and which we know as ambiguity. We see that in the motivational interviewing modeling. So, like, having an idea around what this gap is, why this gap's here, and how can we make sure the intent is and followed through as an action. And then you get back round to the situation, right? If that action doesn't happen, then we discuss in with accuracy the situation, and we go around again. So this is not a one and done situation. It is a repetitive nature, and I find myself quite regularly moving through this feedback loop with clients. It's part of the practice, individually applied, obviously, but it's a general principle. So just to look at it again, it's kind of like cascading effect. So situation where we anchor it in, establish precise during our check-in call yesterday at 2 p.m. It doesn't really matter how and what, but it's important that it is specific and it is dialed in on. The behavior is an observational aspect, so it would come onto the camera in analogy in just a second, but having that as a behavior observation, impact the consequences, and having the discussion around stepping back without blame, without judgment, but almost understanding with clarity what the impact is. It's fine if you're okay with that being the impact, we're good. But it's about raising that into the conversational fold so that we can both, as a client and as a coach, communicate around what this impact is. In business, it's really important as well. If you're working in teams and if you're working with people, by ignoring the impact of what is happening, so you might talk about the behavior and then move on to the intent. It's like, well, we haven't actually fully grasped the impact here, and therefore it leaves the intent, i.e., the action that we're going to move on to, very fallible because there isn't a full understanding of the impact. So it's such an important position to really grasp the impact, but you can't go around blaming and pointing fingers. It just has to be an overall understanding of what the consequence has been. And then the intent, exploring, and a lot of this is about hope and a little bit optimism and a lot of bit of visionary process, which can fold in quite nicely to other models as well, which we'll come on to. So let's think about like the step 1 and 2, this anchoring and observation. A really nice way to do this is to remove the evaluative side of things and actually just deal with the pure observation, from an objective nature. So, when you think about taking a picture of something, you factually capture what's happening in the moment, right? So it's there, it's taken, and it's recorded. Now, you maybe like if you can't record it and you can't factually see it, and it can't be noted and it can't be repeatedly looked at and seen, and the same kind of record be seen, then you are effectively moving it into a case where it's your interpretation, it's your opinion, um it's your understanding of the reality. Whereas if you have it where it's verifiable and it is repeatedly understood, then it is factual. So it's about making it an objective observation rather than a subjective assumption. And a good example, like say for this here, like if someone didn't check in or someone didn't complete their training sessions or whatever it might be, and someone made an evaluative standpoint from a subjective nature, and they were like, well, you were obviously unmotivated this week then. It's like, No, that's not the anchoring of the observation, the situation. The situation is you completed one out of the four planned workouts. That's all we do at this point when we're giving the feedback. We make the observation and we understand what has factually happened. So in like, whatever, if you look back in 6 months' time at this particular week, you would see that only one of the four plan workouts was completed. Whether they were motivated or not, you wouldn't know. So it's important because if you start this process off on the wrong foot, it can be quite difficult to um, have meaningful follow-on stages. When we think about the consequence and the curiosity side of impact and intent, so we want to be able to understand the positioning of the coach. So when we think about the consequences and we're talking about impact, we have to position ourselves with an eye statement. So I am concerned we might unintentionally stall your progress in the goals that we've discussed because of X, Y, and Z with the consequence in tow. So it's not about blaming and it's not about having a constructed viewpoint of who's or why this has happened. Again, it's like the consequence of this, irregardless of anything else, is that it's going to hold us back from moving in the direction we want. And then when you pivot that into the intent, you would essentially, as a coaching angle would often be, is to get them to solve their own problems rather than saying you could do this or prescribing, falling into the right and reflex trap, whatever it might be. But the intent is where you would, through the collaboration but them owning the situation, look to find a solution themselves, or to at least have a setup of going out to experiment to see if they can move past whatever has stalled their progress or whatever has stopped them getting the actions completed that they wanted to. So when we go through the steps 1 and 2, the anchoring and observation, it's almost like this is emotional mastery, right? And we're not, what we're trying to do here is, to a degree, remove the emotions so we can actually get a grasp of what's happening factually and from an observational point of view. We know that emotions are going to be prevalent because they're human. We're human beings. Clients are human beings, right? So what we don't want to do is we don't want to allow for emotions to be brought into this feedback loop in an escalative way, which then undermines the ability to be able to get a clear understanding and a picture of what's happening to be able to move forward. So it is kind of like it's mastering emotions in a sense of they're here, but they're not. We don't want them playing a massive role in what's going on in this feedback loop because otherwise it can just get out of hand quite quickly. And just to focus here on this ambiguity, I mentioned it earlier, and the ambiguity gap is quite important when we think about coaching because people flitter and flutter and go backward and forward, and it's not a bad thing because as a coach we can go, oh, these people, they're just like, why can't they, where's the ambiguity, where's it coming from, why are they indecisive? But it actually tells us a lot. So it's better that we see ambiguity and we can have the dance with it rather than sit on the edge of the dance floor and just watch it cause chaos, right? It's good that we're involved with it. It's good we can see it, and it's good that we can actually interact with it in the right way. Because ambiguity is often, especially if it's quite brutally undermines the process, it is in a sense a saboteur of the coaching journey. So, it's important that we have a sense of how do we bridge such a problematic entity within the coaching world. Well, the questions that and the connections that we make is through the client intention and how that's actually going to impact their world in a meaningful and sustainable way, and what are the outcomes they're going to achieve through making the changes or that they are ambiguous about. I think that when I reflect, the times where I've had the most clients with the highest levels of ambiguity is when I've been challenged the most with coaching. And the reason why, because it's being able to clear the mist and the fog so that the client can actually make that connection between what they're intending to do and how it's actually going to impact them in a long-term way. And that is a patience and a taking the right moment at the right time to ask the right question. So it can be health, fitness, it can be in life. It doesn't really matter. You can. You can apply this to people which are looking to make clear, intentional plans on their nutrition and keep failing, or attend to their exercise and keep struggling to maintain routines. And you can apply it to these. You can also apply it to people that keep wanting to make career changes, or people that want to move out of difficult relationships that they're in, but they're to and froing. The ambiguity gap is seen and is applicable in many domains of life. But let's focus on a little bit of the health fitness one. So nutritional check-in failure. So if someone is in a situation where the person has not tracked or checked in with their nutrition as they necessarily had agreed or wanted to at the beginning of the coaching journey, if you were to have an evaluative approach in a negative, in an ineffective way, not negative, in an ineffective way, you'd be looking at the comments such as, you need to be more committed. If you don't track, you're wasting time. Now, as coaches, I'm sure people listening to this are like, well, I wouldn't say that. And that's absolutely fine. This is an extreme example of what might be said. But if you move along that continuum, and you might, in a way, not said it as quite directly as that, but it might have left that thought in your client's head, then this pivot using this feedback model is where you would, start to bring up the point in a objective way. So you're looking at, when logs are missing, I don't have the data that I need to be able to have the conversation with you around targets, for example. And it's not about looking at them in a personal way. It's about making the observational fact and bringing it to the conversational table in order to be able to have that. And then when we look at like gym avoidance, so in this sense, so you just have to push through these feelings of insecurity. Say, for example, if someone was avoiding going to the gym because they felt like they didn't belong there, for example. Now, the kind of evaluative language that can be used, again, this is an extreme example. You can look at it at different levels along the continuum, but you would need to again be factual. So you wrote you felt too uncoordinated to go to the gym, or can you tell me what you were thinking when you looked at your plan, or when you were looking to go to the gym and you decided not to? So these are the kind of questions that you would ask in order to be able to pivot a better sense of feedback and loop in order to be able to get to the bottom of what's going on. And again, here you see just another emotional eating scenario. The client binge eats during a stressful week, cancels a check-in out of shame. Now, we have some tendencies as coaches to potentially ourselves react emotionally to such a scenario. Now, if we were to react emotionally, we may make decisions that would not necessarily be conducive to that individual's coaching journey. And that could be around tightening the meal plan. It could be around having a kind of assumptive well, your self-sabotaging mindset. We don't know. We don't know what's going on, but the intervention breakdown, where you would look at the situation, behavior, impact, and intent, is a lot clearer in being able to get to the nub of the problem as much as we can within scope of practice in order to be able to support the client more effectively. So having a structured way in which we move through that conversation is going to be better for them, better for us as coaches, because it gives us a certain amount of calmness when we know how to have that conversation. When we think about the SBII model and self-sabotage, so you can find that if people are dropping off or their behaviors are starting to break down that aren't then conducive to agreed actions, expectations in order to move the coaching journey forward, we can look at having a breakdown and a ladder to rebuild back up to the position where most of the actions are being taken. So here, we'll drill down a bit more detail in the next slide, but here you might see, the full action, which would be, 45-minute gym sessions with some cardio, eating well, or, the full shebang all working. And then if that falls by the wayside, i.e. the all or nothing kind of situation, they've just thrown it all in the garbage, then you might need to go back and find out, well, what's the lowest friction that we can do? What's the run one or two of the ladder that we can just get this process back into place, and then expand up, and increase the engagement and volume of, actions that they're taking towards their goals that they've agreed. Again, it's just like I said, previous side, looking at the defeating the all or nothing mentality. So here's another example here. So just like breaking down here, like if you've got the full action where you can have everything, you've got high energy, but then if you've got energy a bit lower, so okay, what's realistic for this average energy day, cooking wise, nutrition wise, training wise. And then if you're on like a low energy day, and this can be quite good for people that maybe have different kind of have mood impacts, emotional impacts. We can kind of, could be neurodivergency as well. Having this capability of being able to ladder something effectively and to give them permission to do this can be very useful, on the basis of, they potentially see something as a failure if it's not completely, I'll give you an example. Someone I'm working with at the moment, if they don't do 12 reps in their set, they see it as a failure. So we're kind of getting to understand and change, well, if they don't do the full session of, I don't know, 8 exercises, they see it as a failure. So we're in this breaking it down into this ladder, so feeding back this loop of like, well, okay, what's your energy levels today, what's your time constraints today, and being able to understand that making adjustments actually allow you to celebrate every run of the ladder as a success rather than only the top run of the ladder. So it's interesting to how we can apply this in and with coaching different personalities or neurodivergency. When we think here, it's something that kind of a nod to professional boundaries here, because it is important that when we're feeding back, sometimes we can uncover various different things. So when very simply, when it's a coaching mandate, when is it and does it become a clinical focus? Client-centered goals, mobilizing internal strengths, supporting and being accountable, being an accountability person, and then observing the behavioral changes that are happening when we think about the action, the behavior, observation, impact, and intent, and making observations around those and how it's changing and how it's facilitating the coaching journey. All good. If we're in this, and diagnosis of medical or mental illness or conditions, health conditions, psychological therapeutic treatments, interpreting, any kind of data or anything like that, or recommending clinical interventions. That's not within our position to do those kind of things. And one thing when we're giving feedback and we're talking and we're going, the thing is with the feedback side of things, it can, if you give feedback well, you start to uncover stuff, right? That by the nature of conversation, if we're discussing what's happening and we're getting a bit deeper, we're understanding about how or what our clients are operating through, there are going to be times when it becomes deeper and more of a concern for the wider mental health or clinical issues that could come into play. So if those are, then these are just some indications as to what you can do. I'm just very aware that when we're discussing around emotional well-being, emotional mastery, that these kind of parameters do come up. So when we think about reflective mirroring and we, observing that, and then we look at the different pathways, NHS pathways, private pathways, to various different professionals. And this is the part here, which I think is very important, is the co-management or the pause, right? So you can have people that work together in conjunction to support individuals, coaches, therapists, clinicians. It doesn't matter. You can work as a team. But then obviously, the real kind of back end of it here is if it goes into crisis and we need to get someone in quick. And I would say over my years of coaching, there are times where I've had to get someone in, fairly quick around, not necessarily off the back of one feedback session, but as we've been moving through and feeding back, things have risen to the surface which have needed to be dealt with. So the reason I put the professional boundaries and handover protocol in is because if you're good at giving feedback and getting if you're good at giving feedback and then having this loop where you keep exploring in an honest, authentic way with your client, deepening the relationship with them, understanding about them more, people have shit going on in their lives which is going to come to the surface, and then you need to know what to do with it. So that's why I think when we go more in these supervision type calls, it's important that we have this in the forefront of our mind of like, well, where do we go with this? Who do we take this to? Um, just a little thought process, just something to stick in there, just to get you thinking a little bit. If feedback wasn't about correcting people, but about helping them see something they couldn't previously see, how might that change the way you coach? Also in management, I think this is a huge thing, right? If you're giving feedback to people, if we frame it so we're just trying to get them to see something they can't necessarily or aren't necessarily aware of, how would that change the communication you have within a professional setting, coaching or feeding back? This is just how a couple of the other ways in which the SBII model can slip into desk and grow, and how you can use the ways in which it can express feelings about future consequences and repeated boundary breaks, i.e., not meeting intentions. And then with the grow model, looking to see how you can use the SBII feedback to help the client look forward in a planning way towards a goal. So there's overlap with different, the feedback aspect with different forward-looking models of coaching. And this, I think, this one here is just about how professional coaching is collaborative and non-clinical and forward-looking, as mentioned in the previous slide, like bringing together those models in order to be able to create that look forward, mobilize internal strengths, and give that person a sense of a journey of account, and you're holding them accountable to that, and just be aware of what's out of scope. And that's just repeating some of the same stuff. So here are the questions again, where we can look at and have a bit of a chat over. So if you've